I'm in the shark's mouth with a blood pack in my mouth, going underwater, on top of water, and then I see...
The 1975 hit, Jaws changed the game for blockbusters. But for a long time, everyone started thinking twice about going into the water. What some people do not realize is that some scenes ended in the cutting room department. They did not make it to the movie. For many reasons, these scenes did not appear perhaps because of intensity or just because of a simple cause. These deleted scenes give a whole new layer to the movie we all thought we knew. The shark attack. One of the more fascinating behind-the-scenes facts about Jaws involves a scene that didn't quite make it into the final cut, or at least not in its original extended form. We're talking about the infamous beach attack, where young Alex Kintner becomes one of the shark's most tragic victims. In the version that most of us have seen, the scene is already pretty intense. There's a sudden eruption of chaos, people screaming, water splashing everywhere. And then, just like that, he's gone. It's a brutal moment that sticks with you. But interestingly, there was actually a longer version of this sequence that got trimmed down before the movie hit theaters. In the extended cut, we apparently get a few extra seconds, just enough to ramp up the tension and horror even more. There's more build-up before the attack, which makes the moment of violence hit that much harder. We also get a longer look at the aftermath, more panicked beachgoers, more screaming parents, and a more lingering shot of the blood-churned ocean. It was gorier, messier, and arguably even more emotionally devastating. Steven Spielberg ultimately decided to scale it back, and honestly, it's probably one of the smartest creative decisions he could have made. He's famously said that he wanted suspense to be the star of Jaws, not the gore. And that philosophy shows throughout the film. By holding back on the blood and guts and letting our imaginations do the work, he created something far more terrifying. It's that old less is more approach, and it absolutely works in Jaws. That decision, to suggest horror rather than shove it in the audience's face, is a big part of what made the film so effective and enduring. Still, it's fascinating to imagine what that extended version might have felt like. How much more visceral could it have been? Would it have tipped the balance from suspenseful thriller into outright horror? We'll never fully know, but those little glimpses behind the curtain give us an even deeper appreciation for Spielberg's instincts as a filmmaker. Sometimes, what gets left on the cutting room floor is just as interesting as what ends up on the screen. Something in Bottom of the Ocean. One of the creepiest deleted moments from Jaws, and that's saying something considering how terrifying the movie already is, involves a severed leg slowly drifting to the bottom of the ocean. Yeah, it's exactly as unsettling as it sounds. This scene was originally part of the attack on the poor guy in the estuary, and while the final cut of the film already shows enough to make your stomach drop, this particular shot cranked up the horror to another level. The visual was apparently really graphic, just a lone, lifeless leg sinking through the murky water, gently spinning as it descended into the depths. There's something deeply eerie about that image. It's not just gore for shock value, it taps into this primal fear of what lies beneath, of the unseen violence happening just below the surface. It's haunting, and that's probably why Spielberg ended up pulling it. According to reports, test audiences were seriously disturbed by it. And if Jaws test audiences, people already watching a film about a giant killer shark, found this moment too much, then you know it must have been pretty intense. Spielberg, always tuned in to the balance between fear and spectacle, decided it crossed a line. The goal wasn't to gross people out, it was to scare them smartly. That difference is part of what makes Jaws so effective, even decades later. And honestly, it's probably the right call. One of the brilliant things about Jaws is how it plays with what you don't see. The horror is more psychological than visual. Spielberg famously limited the shark's screen time, partly because of mechanical issues, but it worked in his favor. And by doing so, he let our imaginations fill in the blanks. A leg floating in the deep might have made the moment more graphic, but it also might have pulled viewers out of the suspense and into pure shock. Still, for die-hard fans and horror buffs, this deleted shot is one of those "I wish I could have seen that" moments. It offers a glimpse into just how far the filmmakers were willing to push things before reeling them back in. It also shows how much thought goes into crafting fear, not just throwing blood on the screen, but creating imagery that lingers in your mind long after the credits roll. So while the leg never made it into the final cut, its existence adds to the mythos of Jaws. It's another reminder that what we saw on screen was carefully, even masterfully curated. Spielberg knew just how much to show, and just how much to leave behind in the editing room to make Jaws not only a box office smash, but a timeless classic in cinematic suspense. The in-between scene. Another scene that tends to come up a lot in fan discussions of Jaws is a quiet, easily overlooked moment between Chief Brody and his wife, Ellen. It's not one of the big set-piece scenes with dramatic music or life-or-death stakes. There's no shark lurking in the water, no frantic beach panic, no intense boat chase. Instead, it's just the two of them, late at night, having a simple, heartfelt conversation. But sometimes, those are the scenes that leave the biggest impact, not because they're loud, but because they feel real. In this particular moment, Brody opens up a little about the stress he's carrying, the kind that builds up slowly, but weighs you down like a rock. He's the police chief of a town that's suddenly being torn apart by a series of terrifying shark attacks, and the responsibility of keeping people safe, especially when he's not sure how, is clearly eating away at him. The scene reportedly gives us a much more intimate look at his emotional state. You can see the tension in his body, hear the fatigue in his voice, and Ellen, quietly supportive, is right there with him, grounding him in the middle of the chaos. It's not flashy or dramatic, and maybe that's why it didn't make the final cut. Spielberg ultimately decided to remove it, most likely to tighten the film's pacing and keep the focus on the escalating danger. From a storytelling perspective, it makes sense. Jaws is a thriller after all, and thrillers thrive on momentum. Every minute that doesn't move the story forward can feel like a slowdown, and Spielberg was clearly aiming for a lean, tense experience that never lets up. But at the same time, this kind of quiet moment could have added even more emotional depth to Brody's character. We already root for him. He's a good man, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. But this scene would have shown us more of the toll it's taking on him personally. It would have reminded us that under the badge and behind the grim determination is a man who's scared, exhausted, and struggling to hold it all together. And in doing so, it would have made him even more relatable. In some ways, that's one of the things Jaws does so well already. It balances the terror of the shark with the very human responses of the people involved. So the idea of a cut scene like this, one that digs deeper into Brody's psyche, makes fans wonder what more could have been explored. Would it have slowed the film down a bit? Maybe. But would it also have made us care just a little more about what happens to him? Probably. It's one of those fascinating what-ifs of filmmaking. Every scene that gets trimmed is a trade-off: emotion versus pace, character versus action. And while Spielberg clearly made the right calls, Jaws is a masterpiece after all, it's always intriguing to think about the moments that didn't make it. Sometimes, a small, quiet scene can tell you just as much about a character as a big, dramatic one. And in Brody and Ellen's late-night talk, we might have seen just a little more of the man behind the badge and the personal cost of keeping Amity Island safe. We lost a bit of Quint. Then there's the bizarre but fascinating deleted scene featuring Quint at a local store. It's not one that made it into the final cut of Jaws, but for fans who've dug through the extras or heard about it over the years, it's definitely one of the more memorable what could have been moments. In this scene, Quint, already known for being a larger-than-life character, is in rare form, drunkenly rambling to a group of townspeople about sharks.
Robert, who is an extraordinary actor, I mean, just extraordinary. But, you know, we all knew he had a little bit of a drinking issue.
It's loud, it's strange, and it's absolutely overflowing with Robert Shaw's raw energy. What makes the scene stand out is how unfiltered and off the rails it feels. Quint, already introduced as something of a mysterious, eccentric figure, lets it all fly here. He rants, he slurs, he delivers these weirdly poetic lines about the sea and sharks, and you can't help but be both amused and a little unnerved. Robert Shaw, as always, is completely magnetic. He commands the screen, even in this unpolished, chaotic moment. It's like watching a guy who's been haunted by his past, trying to cope the only way he knows how, by yelling into the void with a bottle in hand. But, as entertaining as it is, Spielberg made the call to cut the scene, and it's not hard to see why. The film thrives on its tight pacing and steadily increasing tension, and this scene, while fun, kind of stalls the momentum. It doesn't really push the plot forward, and it sits in this strange tonal space that's more comedic and erratic than suspenseful. When you're building up to a terrifying sea hunt, a sidetrack into drunken storytelling can feel like the brakes are being slammed. Still, for fans of the movie, and especially of Quint, this scene offers something kind of special. It adds even more color to an already vivid character. We already know he's a little unhinged, but this scene shows the full spectrum of his madness and charm. It gives a peek into how the townspeople see him. A local legend, maybe, but also kind of a loose cannon. And it gives us more of that unpredictable energy that makes Quint so memorable in the first place.
You all know me, know how I earn a living. I'll catch this bird for you, but it ain't gonna be easy. It's bad fish.
The final version of Jaws is tight, suspenseful, and nearly flawless in its pacing. But these lost moments, like Quint's store rant, are still fun to think about. They remind us of how much personality and texture goes into building a character, even if not all of it ends up on the screen. And for those who love Jaws, those little behind-the-scenes gems only deepen the appreciation for what made the movie great in the first place. So, is Jaws worth watching, or just brutal? When someone brings up Jaws, the first image that probably pops into your head is a giant shark fin slicing through the water, accompanied by that slow, pulsing, dun-dun music. It's iconic. Even if you've never seen the movie, chances are you've felt the ripple effects of its legacy. But here's the real question. Is Jaws still actually worth watching in 2025? Or is it just an outdated, overly brutal thriller that's been overhyped for decades? Let's unpack that. Let's start with the elephant, or rather, the great white in the room. Yes, Jaws has its brutal moments just like few mentioned earlier. It's a film about a monstrous shark attacking swimmers off the coast of a small New England town. So naturally, there are a few scenes that make you wince. People do get attacked. There's blood in the water. And you definitely see some panicked, helpless flailing. But here's the twist. For all its reputation, Jaws isn't actually a gore fest. In fact, it's surprisingly restrained compared to modern horror films. The reason behind that restraint is partly practical. Spielberg's mechanical shark kept breaking down during filming, so he had to rely on suggestion rather than outright spectacle. And that turned out to be a stroke of genius. Because of the limited visibility of the shark, the suspense becomes psychological. You feel the danger long before you see it, which makes the eventual attacks more terrifying, not less. It's not just about blood and bites. The real fear comes from the unknown. The tension of knowing something is lurking just beneath the surface. That's a kind of horror that doesn't rely on jump scares or buckets of fake blood. It taps into a primal fear, and that's what makes it so effective even now. But Jaws isn't just a creature feature with a big fish. What really gives it staying power are its characters and story. The film follows Chief Martin Brody, the police chief of Amity Island, a small tourist town that's about to kick off its busy summer season. When a young woman is slain by a shark, Brody wants to close the beaches. But the town's mayor is more worried about the economic fallout than public safety. That conflict between doing what's right and what's profitable still feels incredibly relevant today. Brody himself is a standout protagonist. He's not a muscle-bound action hero. He's a regular guy, a little nervous around the water, doing his best to protect his community. Then there's Matt Hooper, the oceanographer played by Richard Dreyfuss, who brings science and wit to the situation. And of course, there's Quint, the salty, weathered shark hunter who's equal parts fascinating and unhinged. They're dynamic, especially once they're all stuck on a boat together hunting the shark, is what gives the film its heart and its humor. One of the best scenes in the entire movie isn't even a shark attack. It's a quiet moment where the three men share stories, compare scars, and bond over their shared fears. Quint's monologue about the USS Indianapolis, a chilling real-life naval disaster, is the kind of storytelling that leaves a mark. It's raw, haunting, and completely human. Now, let's be honest, if you're used to fast-paced modern thrillers or horror movies that hit the gas from minute one, Jaws might feel slow at first. The first act is all about building tension. You see glimpses of the shark, hints of danger, and lots of wide shots of the ocean that feel uneventful. But that slow burn is exactly what makes it work. Spielberg lets the suspense simmer. You know something's coming. You just don't know when. That patience pays off. When the action finally ramps up, it feels earned. The danger feels real. And because you've had time to get to know the characters, you actually care what happens to them. This isn't just a monster movie. It's a survival story, a study in fear, and a pretty insightful look at human nature under pressure. Visually, Jaws does a great job of creating an atmosphere. The beach town feels real, not like a movie set. The cinematography uses water, shadows, and distance to keep you guessing. And then there's that score. Two notes that have probably done more to ruin summer swims than any horror film before or since. It's simple, but devastatingly effective. Even today, it can raise the hairs on the back of your neck. So, is it worth watching? In short, absolutely yes. Jaws isn't just a movie about a shark. It's a masterclass in suspense, a brilliantly acted character drama, and a turning point in film history. It literally invented the idea of the summer blockbuster. And despite being made nearly 50 years ago, it holds up shockingly well. Sure, the shark itself might look a little rubbery in 4K, but honestly, that almost adds to the charm. The real terror of Jaws doesn't come from special effects. It comes from storytelling. It's in the way it builds tension, the way it makes you care, and the way it taps into something deeply human, the fear of what we can't see. So no, Jaws isn't just a brutal, dated shark movie. It's a smart, thrilling, and surprisingly emotional ride that's still worth diving into. Decent or a huge hit? When Jaws hit theaters in the summer of 1975, nobody could have predicted just how massive it would become. Directed by a young Steven Spielberg and based on the novel by Peter Benchley, Jaws didn't just scare people out of the water, it made waves at the box office and completely changed the way Hollywood thought about summer movies. Financially speaking, Jaws was a monster hit. It pulled in around $476.5 million worldwide. And keep in mind, that's in 70s money. At the US box office alone, it earned about $260 million, which made it the highest-grossing film of all time until Star Wars came along 2 years later in 1977. Adjusted for inflation, Jaws would have made over $2 billion today, putting it up there with the likes of Avengers, Endgame, and Avatar in terms of financial impact. What's even more interesting is how Jaws helped invent the modern summer blockbuster. Before this movie, summer wasn't really considered a prime time for big releases. Studios used to save their prestige projects for the fall or winter. But Spielberg and Universal Pictures flipped the script. They rolled out Jaws with a massive marketing campaign, including a ton of TV spots, which wasn't common at the time, and released it on hundreds of screens all at once. It was one of the first films to do what's called a wide release, which is now the standard for big movies. Of course, the money didn't just come from ticket sales. Jaws also raked in cash through merchandise, home video, and later re-releases. It became a full-blown cultural phenomenon, from that iconic two-note shark theme to the countless parodies and references in pop culture. The success of the film even turned Spielberg into a household name.
With then 27-year-old director Steven Spielberg at the helm, Jaws opened in the summer on a then unheard-of 450 screens.
So yeah, Jaws didn't just make a lot of money. It changed the movie industry forever. Not bad for a film that was famously plagued with production issues, from malfunctioning shark models to shooting delays. In the end, though, it all came together in a way that audiences loved and kept coming back for. Now, let's look on the next Jaws that followed. All the Jaws that followed. The one that changed everything. Let's start with the obvious. The original Jaws is a cinematic landmark. Directed by a young Steven Spielberg, it redefined what a summer blockbuster could be. But beyond its massive commercial success, what really makes Jaws special is how masterfully it builds suspense. The shark isn't constantly in your face, partly because the mechanical shark, Bruce, kept breaking down. But that limitation turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Spielberg leaned into suggestion over spectacle, letting eerie music, clever camera angles, and audience imagination do the heavy lifting. As a result, the fear feels primal and personal. But it's not just about the scares. The human characters in Jaws are what anchor the film. Chief Brody is a reluctant hero. He's afraid of the water, new to the island, and totally out of his element. Hooper brings a bit of levity and intellect, while Quint, the grizzled shark hunter, adds depth and darkness. Their interactions on the boat in the final act are some of the best in movie history. Tense, emotional, and surprisingly funny. Quint's haunting USS Indianapolis monologue is a showstopper, chilling in its delivery and unforgettable in content. Everything about the original Jaws just works. It's a rare film where all the pieces, acting, directing, music, editing, come together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Jaws 2, 1978. The decent, if unnecessary, sequel. Jaws 2 had a tough act to follow, and to its credit, it didn't totally flop. Released 3 years after the original, it brings back Roy Scheider as Chief Brody, who once again finds himself trying to convince the town of Amity Island that there's danger in the water. This time, it's another great white, and once again, the town doesn't want to listen. While the setup feels familiar, the film makes a few changes to keep things fresh, like focusing more on a group of teenagers stranded on a sailboat. A smart move that raises the stakes and creates new dynamics. There are definitely moments that work. The attack scenes are still pretty tense, and the tone tries to stay in line with the original's balance of suspense and character drama. But without Spielberg behind the camera, and without that same level of nuance, the film ends up feeling more like a thriller than a carefully crafted piece of suspense. It also leans more heavily on action, especially toward the end, which sacrifices some of the slow burn tension that made the original so gripping. Still, Jaws 2 is far from a disaster. In the world of sequels, especially horror sequels, it holds up reasonably well. It doesn't deepen the mythology much, but it doesn't trash it either, which is more than we can say for the films that followed. Jaws 3D, 1983, the one that went off the rails. Now we enter weird territory. Jaws 3D took a wild turn by ditching Amity Island entirely and setting the story in a Florida marine park, which is basically a SeaWorld stand-in. Dennis Quaid plays Mike Brody, yes, Chief Brody's now grown son, and he's working as an engineer at the park when, you guessed it, a giant great white shark manages to sneak into the underwater tunnels and attractions. And if that sounds a little ridiculous, that's because it is. Throw in some early 80s 3D effects that haven't aged well, and you've got a film that's more of a campy curiosity than a worthy sequel. What's most noticeable about Jaws 3D is how far removed it is from the tone of the original. Where Jaws was grounded in realism and suspense, this one feels more like a creature feature on cable TV. The characters are pretty thin, the dialogue is awkward, and the shark looks more like a special effects experiment than a threat. The 3D gimmicks are distracting too. Shark teeth flying at the camera, blood spurting out in weird directions. It's all very over-the-top and unintentionally funny. That said, there's a strange charm to it if you're in the mood for something cheesy. It's not scary, it's not serious, but it is kind of fun in a "this is so bad, it's entertaining" kind of way. Still, from a storytelling and quality perspective, it's a huge step down from the first two. Jaws, The Revenge, 1987, the one everyone tries to forget. And then, finally, we arrive at Jaws, The Revenge, the fourth and final film in the franchise, and easily the most infamous. This is the movie where things go fully off the deep end. The plot centers around Ellen Brody, now a widow, who becomes convinced that a shark is targeting her family out of revenge. Not only does the shark travel to the Bahamas, yes, the shark migrates south to find them, but it seems to have a personal vendetta and even a psychic connection to Ellen. It's completely absurd and defies all logic, even within the loose rules set by the previous films. The performances range from wooden to bewildered, and not even Michael Caine, yes, he's in this, can salvage the mess. The special effects are arguably the worst in the series. The shark looks laughable, and the final kill scene has been mocked endlessly for its ridiculous slow motion and roaring shark. Seriously, it roars. Everything that made the original great, subtlety, character-driven tension, grounded fear, is completely gone. Instead, we get melodrama, clunky exposition, and a script that seems like it was written on a dare. There's not much to redeem here. Even fans of bad movies have trouble sitting through it. It's the kind of film that's so misguided. It feels like a parody of the original. It's not just a bad Jaws movie. It's one of the worst sequels in Hollywood history, full stop. The franchise was clearly running on fumes by this point, and The Revenge sealed its fate. Looking at the Jaws series as a whole, it follows a pretty classic pattern of franchise decline. The original film is a high point not just for shark movies, but for the entire thriller genre. It was carefully crafted, brilliantly directed, and filled with memorable performances and smart writing. Then, with each subsequent film, a little bit of that magic was chipped away. Jaws 2 was passable. It still had Roy Scheider, a few good scares, and a decent story. But by Jaws 3D, the series had become more spectacle than story. And Jaws, The Revenge, was basically a punchline. The most obvious change across the films is tone. The first movie is grounded, slow-burning, and rooted in character drama. As the series goes on, it shifts toward camp, gimmicks, and increasingly implausible plots.
But we are currently in Jaws season, and its first sequel, surprisingly enough, is far better than it has any right to be.
The realism disappears, and with it, the sense of dread that made the original so gripping. Another major difference is in the filmmaking itself. Spielberg's careful attention to detail and pacing gave the original its lasting power. None of the directors who followed captured that same level of control or artistry. The Jaws franchise is one of those rare series where the first movie is so good, so impactful, that it casts a long shadow over everything that came after. While the sequels tried to keep the franchise alive, they just couldn't recapture what made the original so special. The characters weren't as strong, the writing wasn't as sharp, and the tension turned into spectacle. It's a classic case of Hollywood trying to squeeze more money out of a hit without understanding why it worked in the first place. That said, there's still something kind of fun about watching the decline unfold. Whether it's the surprisingly okay Jaws 2, the goofy ride that is Jaws 3D, or the train wreck of Jaws, The Revenge, each film shows a different side of what happens when a franchise keeps going past its expiration date. But no matter how bad the sequels got, nothing can touch the greatness of that first film. It's the one that started it all, and it's the one we'll keep going back to. Year after year, summer after summer. Every time we hear that two-note theme and start scanning the water just a little more carefully. Are you a fan of the movie too? Or the franchise series? Tell us what you think in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.